I wanted to make this kind of just extra discussion, so it's not really a lecture, and it's not um, the material that I'm covering right now isn't necessarily what you're graded on, but in taking the course that you're taking, um, I would think that someone at some point would ask you, "Hey, what have you learned this semester?" That kind of thing, or "What are you learning about right now?" And maybe this could even be the thing that you then um, talk about. And the thing I do want to talk about is inflation. It's just historic right now. What's happening? I remember my very first semester ever of teaching, fall of 2005, and I remember even at that point talking about inflation and saying, it's just really not an American problem anymore. Um, and it wasn't. I mean, inflation since the late 70s has really, and that would then count for most of your lifetime, has been about 2 to 3%. And that's really all it's been at until COVID. Um, and it's not the pandemic itself that has caused it, but rather, I will argue, the reaction to it that's caused the problem. Um, my um, personal economic belief um, is actually related to the money supply, with the idea that the pandemic, which you kind of see right here, and let's just focus on the past 5 years, you see a marked increase in the money supply in an attempt to basically keep the economy going um, at a time when things were shutting down because of COVID. So, to avoid economic collapse, the Federal Reserve flooded the market with money. And we see that right here, right? That um, it goes from $15 trillion to 21, right? Nearly a 50% increase. There's, I cannot conceive of a way, from all that I know, it's very difficult for me to conceive of a way that you would not get inflation from that. And why is that? Because if you have more money being printed, the existing money becomes less valuable. All of this money is just pushing to get spent right now. So, right, in some sense, a lot of the demand out there by consumers and businesses is because they're sitting on these huge accounts of money and they're just waiting to spend it. And it's fueling further this inflation. So I just made a few slides just to kind of talk about it in general. So what's the headline number? The headline number um, is a 7% inflation in the month of December, captured on an annualized basis. This is the third month in a row where it's increased over 3%, or sorry, over 6%. It was 6.8% in November. All of this ends up being that this is the highest inflation rate since June of 1982. Um, so it's pretty high. Um, Even if you take out the volatile components of inflation, you still get an inflation rate of 5.5%. That's the highest since 1991. And that was a crisis caused by an oil crisis the first time that we fought with Iraq. Um, I don't get it. The inflation didn't just happen the past 3 months, it's been happening all year, 2021. And, um, from at least what we're told within the Federal Reserve, the belief was that it was going to be a temporary phenomenon. It was going to exist as supply chain um, problems were worked through, but that eventually it would go away. I personally didn't believe it, and I don't believe it, just because inflation is just one of those things that once it starts rolling, it really it's like a snowball going down a mountain because it gets baked in then into business contracts, into labor agreements. People start buying stuff because they're worried about the price being higher in the future. Um, it doesn't stop that easily. Um, let's look at the numbers here from the Federal Reserve Economic Database, fred.stlouisfed.org. And let's look at this as we measure inflation from the Consumer Price Index, CPI. And let's edit the data so that we look at it from a compounded annual rate of change. Okay, so actually let's take it quarterly, just so the data doesn't look so messy. So this is looking over a rather long period of time. So let's get out of the sensationalism of the number. It is a bad number, 7%. But the Federal Reserve still believes that they can fix the problem. They can fix the problem by not dramatically, but by reducing the money supply so that this problem that's emerging right now will then get reduced. Because again, it hasn't been this high since the early 80s, since I was in kindergarten, which is pretty bad because this is my 44th year of living in this world. So it's pretty bad. That last time that it hit this high of inflation was 1982. It had been coming down from its peak in 1980 of 14.8% inflation rate. That's insane. It's not insane, but it's so incredibly destructive, that kind of inflation rate. Because what it means is that you've got panic buying at that rate. No one wants to hold the US dollar. It's just so incredibly destructive. That inflation rate of 14.8% that came in 1980 was fueled by an oil crisis in Iran when the Shah was deposed and the United States had supported that former leader. So when new leadership came into Iran, they were like, dude, we're not selling you oil anymore. And basically, a Federal Reserve that had increased the money supply too much. I would argue they've done the same right now. And so Arthur Burns, who was the Federal Reserve chairman, was replaced by Paul Volcker by the Carter administration. And Paul Volcker basically racked the interest rate up. He got it up to 19%. And basically, when you have inflation, the only thing you can do is you can intentionally push the economy into a recession to slow the economy down. The closest equivalent I can find of it is like sometimes when you're watching like one of those medical shows and they say like, oh, the person's really, really sick and we're just going to put them into a medically induced coma so they can cure themselves. Well, that's what this is like. Pushing the economy out of that recession. So let's just look at that. If we look at that, and we look at it from, let's just look at it on an annual basis. And let's look at it. You see this data right here. I just kind of tried to clean up a little bit. But you see basically the economy being pushed intentionally. I just averaged out the numbers. Pushed into a recession. And this recession that was right here was the worst since the Great Depression. It was bad. It's really bad. Let's look at this short video. If you had me last semester, you may have seen this before, so just keep that in mind. Okay.
So should all our IT move to the cloud? The cloud would give us more flexibility, but we lose control.
Just gonna wait till we get this advertisement. I guess we don't need to all hear this advertisement. Looks like Calamity. It looks like her lights and her sofa. It's moving around. Sorry, we have to all endure this advertisement. She seems pretty smart. I guess that's why she got Edge to Cloud platform.
About inflation. Inflation. It's the word that's been on everyone's lips lately, and some are looking back at history.
In fact, we've not heard inflation talked this much since really the 1970s.
That's because over the past few months, prices for everything from gasoline to groceries have been rising sharply as the economy roars back from the pandemic recession.
I don't know about that. This seems to imply that the inflation is coming from the fact that people are just buying too much. I'm not convinced that that's the case. My belief, based on the data, is that it's more of the Federal Reserve failing to control the growth of the money supply rather than this unexpected increase in demand. But we'll get to that later here.
This graph charts the Consumer Price Index, a metric that measures the average change in prices for consumer goods and services compared to a year ago, or more simply put, inflation. In May of this year, prices spiked 5%.
Hey, dude, look at that. They used the Federal Reserve Economic Database, Fred, huh? Same stuff we're using.
Annual inflation rate in nearly 13 years. Many economists believe that a small amount of inflation, around 2%, is inevitable
I would agree with that.
Desirable. That's essentially what we've had for the past 15 years before this most recent surge. But these recent increases have some fearing that the U.S. might be returning to the runaway inflation of the 1970s.
No one wants to see that happen again.
So, are we returning to the spiraling inflation of the late 1960s and 1970s? Or is today's inflation, as the Fed assures us, transitory?
Okay, so there, right, this is the reason why I'm showing you this video and wasting 7 minutes of your time, in addition to doing the rest of the lecture. I don't think it's transitory. That's my belief based on the data. I don't think it's transitory. I think it's something more permanent. And what this video is going to show us is a little bit of the history of what's going on that brought us to this point.
This is an extraordinarily unusual time. For those old enough to remember it, the Great Inflation was a period in which the cost of living for millions of Americans soared. From 1965 to 1982, prices for food and everyday consumer items rose dramatically from 2% in 1962 to 15% in 1979. During that same period, unemployment also rose steadily, eventually reaching just above 10%. The term stagflation, an economic condition of both rising inflation and increasing unemployment, became the go-to phrase to describe the period's economic malaise. This was a time when consumers protested rising meat prices, union members picketed for cost of living pay increases, and long lines for unemployment and gas became commonplace.
Here in New Jersey, 10% of the workforce is unemployed. Across the nation, the average is 8%.
The big lesson from the 70s is that kind of nagging, persistent, recurrent double-digit inflation doesn't happen overnight. It sets in over many years. And it set in because of a long series of policy mistakes in Washington.
The Great Inflation has its roots in the government spending of the 1960s. Consumer prices began rising under President Johnson as he escalated the Vietnam War and launched his Great Society social programs.
So the belief right there. Now remember, the Wall Street Journal is a little bit tends to be a little bit conservative, so just keep that in mind. But the argument here is that during the Johnson administration, you get a pretty phenomenal shift in the social support system in the United States. You get the emergence of Medicare, which is health care for the elderly, Medicaid, health care for the poor. You get things like the Head Start program, which is early childhood education for the poor. You get the food stamp program, right? That's food for the poor. So you get all of these kind of poverty reduction programs, plus, we're fighting a war in Vietnam, plus we're trying to put a person on the moon. So those are a lot of expensive things. So the federal government's spending a lot of money, and the Wall Street Journal here is arguing that that pushed the economy to that point.
But the double-digit inflation the period is famous for didn't begin until President Richard Nixon took office.
The time has come for a new economic policy for the United States.
In 1971, Nixon ordered that the dollar would no longer be backed by gold.
So, how do I explain this? When Franklin Roosevelt took office in 1933, March of 1933, one of the first things that he did was he changed the US dollar currency. And he made it so that you could no longer turn in your dollars, that you have in your wallet or purse. And he changed it so that you could no longer turn it in for an equivalent amount of gold. But the US dollar could still be exchanged for gold in international markets among central banks until the Nixon administration changed that in 1971. That was a pretty big shift. The only thing obviously I wasn't born yet, but I do remember my graduate school professor, Kwon Kim, saying that his professor, that Kwon Kim, my professor, came to class as a graduate student, and the professor came into the classroom, talked about this event, and said, "This is the end of the economy." Turns out the guy was pretty darn right, because it was this change that really starts a rampantly high inflation rate in the 1970s that culminates not in a collapse of the US economy by the end of the 70s, but a substantially weaker US economy by the end of the 1970s. So Kwon Kim's professor was correct.
Inflation robs every American, every one of you.
Nixon also influenced the Fed's monetary policy, pushing the central bank to pump more money into the economy.
Oh, that right there. The worst, in my opinion, Federal Reserve chairman was a guy named Arthur Burns. He was the Federal Reserve chairman under Nixon. And basically, the accusation, which has largely been shown true, is that Arthur Burns, let's all get a picture here. Allowed the Nixon administration to kind of push monetary policy, which is just, you should never, if you're the Federal Reserve, you should be largely devoid of the political process. And Arthur Burns was not. He got very close to the Nixon administration. Some, I'm not trying to spread rumors here about Arthur Burns, who I'm not a big fan of, but some say he had some involvement, even possibly with Watergate. Maybe. Who knows? I'm not trying to spread rumors. I'm sure he was a good guy. Probably. Arthur Burns was basically the guy seeing a burning trash can in the alley and like adding gasoline to it. So Johnson administration's not helping it. Nixon, by taking the dollar off the gold standard, isn't helping it. And now Arthur Burns is standing by, spreading gasoline on the fire.
And keep interest rates low.
By letting inflation rise gradually for a number of years, the Fed compromised the trust the public held that the Fed would maintain price stability. Businesses and households started expecting that inflation would persist.
And that's the problem right now that's starting to happen. That for 15, 20, 25 years, we've all known the Federal Reserve will keep the inflation rate low. But now that's starting to go away. Because now we've seen the Federal Reserve has allowed inflation to emerge. And if that goes away, then we all start expecting inflation, baking it into our prices, baking it into our purchasing decisions. And what that does is it means that we try to consume more and more now because we know prices will only go up in the future. And what that means is that it fuels the inflation even further.
Prices went up, workers started pressing hard for unions. As wages went up, companies started raising prices even more. And we got this game of leapfrog where prices and wages both went up.
And we're obviously seeing that right now.
We must whip inflation right now.
These policy missteps continued under President Ford. And later under President Carter, the issue was exacerbated further by OPEC's oil embargoes.
A more serious domestic problem. That problem is inflation.
It wouldn't be until President Jimmy Carter appointed Paul Volcker as the chairman of...
There's Paul Volcker. I think he was 6'5". He was really, really tall. He only passed away a few years ago.
The Federal Reserve, that the great inflation finally began to disappear.
Paul Volcker, the Fed chairman, said, I'm going to stop this cycle. And he clamped down on the growth of money supply and jacked up interest rates. It caused two very severe recessions. But that turned out to be really what needed to happen to get inflation under control.
Volcker's inflation crackdown represented a new chapter for America's monetary policy.
In the 1960s and 1970s, the Fed did not have an articulated inflation targeting strategy, that inflation should be around 2%. And so they were not focused on keeping inflation under control. In the 1970s, the Fed was not even willing to commit to what they meant by price stability. It was kind of trust us, we will deliver, which is horrible policy.
Today, we can see some clear similarities between our modern inflationary period and that of the 1970s. Just like the 70s, prices are rising. The Federal Reserve has increased the money supply, and government spending is up. But comparing today's inflation with that of the entire Great Inflation, especially the 1970s, is not accurate.
I graduated from college in 1975. I had a front row seat. Nothing like that. I don't expect anything like that to happen.
Today's inflation and the threat that we have is actually like the last half of the 1960s. It's not like the 1970s. In the mid-1960s, inflation had been running about 2%. By the end of the 1960s, inflation went to about 5%. Right, the last inflation reading we had was still below 5%. And so you're nowhere near 20%, which was the highest inflation reading at the end of the 1970s. There's almost no period in the 1970s that had inflation as low as we have now.
Some of the recent spikes in inflation are a very healthy sign of the recovery. What we experienced last year wasn't normal. Take airfares in the airline industry. We have this dramatic drop of airfares that was a sign of the risk that the whole industry would collapse. It's a healthy sign that we see a reversal of those increases today.
For their part, the Fed says it remains committed to its long-held stance that today's inflation is temporary.
The Fed believes that we're having a supply shock, and so that's causing shortages and temporary pricing. That's the Fed's theory.
What we're seeing now, we believe, is inflation in particular categories of goods and services that are being directly affected by this unique historical event that none of us has lived through before, called reopening the economy after closing it.
Every time we have an economic...
So, again, I'm not agreeing with this part of the analysis at this point, just to make that known. I don't think this is the inflation like the 60s. I actually think it's not at this point at the 1970s, but it's approaching it, and it only requires a few more policy missteps to get us to that point.
Recovery from a recession. We expect to see inflation rise above 2% for a while. That's normal.
It turns out that these impacts are more than transitory. If they're lasting, they persist or even increase, then the Fed might have to do something to stop it.
On June 16th, Federal Reserve officials signaled that they expect to raise interest rates by late 2023, sooner than they anticipated in March.
And what we did see is that since this was put out, that in June of 2021, we know now that in 2022 is when the interest rate is going to be going up. Okay, so let's go back to this. So, where are we seeing this inflation? Well, there's some things where we're really seeing it. Used cars, up a third in price. Furniture, up 17% in price. The belief, again, throughout 2021 is that all this is transitory. It's going to go away as the supply chain improves. But there's some reason to be concerned, and that reason to be concerned is that the labor market, for instance, is very tight because the unemployment rate's so low, wages are rising dramatically. And those wage increases are passed on to consumers by businesses, and people are going to spend those higher wages on goods and services, thus fueling more of the inflation. So what I want to do here is just look at, when we see that inflation rate of 7%, let's just look at some of the highest points here. Let's start first with automobiles. So we know that there's been this semiconductor shortage. We know that there's been some kind of, the rental car industry sold off most of their inventory as COVID was happening. Then all of a sudden they tried to buy a whole bunch of cars when the economy started to reopen. And it reached a peak in June where used cars had an increased price of 45.2%. And it was still 37.3% for used cars up in December. Even for new cars, 11.8% increase. That's the most since 1975. For used car prices, they've never been as expensive, going up in price as much as they have in 2021. So if you're trying to sell your used car, this is the time to do it. If you're in the market for a car, this is obviously not good news. But you see right there, even with just this very first chart, now we're influencing customer decision patterns and either delaying purchases or trying to do the purchase right away because of this increase in the price. That's not what you want to do. Gasoline, Well, in this case here, you've got more travel going on. We've got a 58.1% increase. That's the sharpest increase since 1980. That was the oil crisis. Now, this is expected to fall, and I actually tend to agree with this one. I don't think gasoline prices can be sustained this high. For automobiles, it does actually take a while to resolve the semiconductor issue, and we know that their semiconductors are a central part of the car production process. So I'm not sure how fast that one will decrease. Home and recreation. Here we're just talking about the fact that people are in their homes more, they're doing more recreation activities. Um, and obviously part of this is just supply shortages. Getting right, the stuff is made overseas, getting it to the United States has become increasingly expensive and delayed. And so we're seeing outdoor equipment going up by about 7.8%, furniture going up by about 14.1%. This will probably come down eventually. Travel. While the airline industry is still hard hit, airline industry is one of the rare areas where they're down 17.9% in December. So you're actually right. That's actually lowering the overall rate of inflation. Hotels and motels, well, you see that increase there of about 11.1%. Now, the next two slides are where you and I would all feel it on a more daily basis. Restaurants, fast food, we're seeing the highest increase for fast food since 1982, 8%. And even for sit down restaurants, 6.6%. All that's fueled by both higher food prices and higher wages for the employees that you have. Um, it's just dramatically higher. And even then, for overall food itself, you've got beef going up 18.6%, pork 15.1%, just regular groceries 6.5%. All of that you're going to experience every day, right, as a food consumer. And the unfortunate part of that is that in the United States, we obviously still have people who faced food insecurity before this all started to happen. And so that's only going to increase now. Yeah, food stamps, the allocation made for it has increased. In fact, I forget what it was. I'm waiting for the web to think about what that is. Sorry, I'm not sure why it's not showing up. I'm not sure. Food stamp increase 2022. Yeah, I mean it. Sorry, this is not. Let's see here. So, food stamps, also known as EBT or SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Yeah, largest increase, I think, an incredibly long period of time. But a family of four, for me, my state of Hawaii, 1573 to feed four people for a month. That's gonna be pretty tough. $835 on the mainland. Also, again, pretty tough. And that's our, I think, the maximum allotment. Okay. And then housing, we're seeing a lot of inflation here. Housing up 3.3% for tenant rent. So that would be like someone renting an apartment. And then for those of you who own a home, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which calculates this, calculates what's called an owner's equivalent rent. What are you yourself paying rent to you as the owner? That's up 3.3%. 3.8%. That would just be because housing prices are becoming more expensive. So, what do we do with all that, right? So, those charts help us kind of see inflation, um, you know, as it exists in these categories that kind of make the headlines. But really, the debate, and this is, I didn't make a slide for this, but here's really what the debate is between that video I showed you and maybe even just my own beliefs. Is what we're facing here is a debate among economists, and economists are not perfect, and we're still trying to understand this phenomenon of inflation. Is that unfortunately we're not going to know what caused it until long after it's over and we have more data. But the uncertainty right now is whether that inflation has a microeconomic source or a macroeconomic source. In other words, is the inflation coming about because firms are just passing on higher prices, or is it happening because of a macroeconomic issue that people are just spending more money and it's pushing firms to have to pay more for employees and everyone's just buying more stuff? In other words, is it cost push or is it demand pull inflation? And that's really what's unknown. As you saw in the video, most of the people are thinking, it's just supply chain aspects. People are spending money and there are higher costs, but those costs are going to be reduced as the supply chain fixes itself. We see some attempts as well by the Biden administration where some believe that the prices are just being passed on by companies. This was one where sorry, it's not looking it up. I don't know why it doesn't look anything up. But if you type into like Google News, news.google.com, and you type in like the Biden administration, what they're trying to do is they're trying to break up, make more competitive the meatpacking industry. Because the belief is that if there's not a lot of meat suppliers, they can pass on their costs easier than if there's a lot of competition, which kind of drives the prices down. I'm not as convinced that that's the case, but what do I know? But that's kind of the exciting thing that we'll learn as the months go on here, is whether we've got more demand pull inflation, which is kind of more of our macro issue where things are pulling the prices higher, or the costs, or do we have some more cost push inflation where the industry is just able to better pass on prices because there's not as much competition? I'm not exactly certain what there is. And also, I'd say a lot of other economists don't know as well.